Welcome back to the Last Days Book Club. As we continue to read the book, I Will Die Free by Alexander Noble with Kay Rizzo. The remarkable story, dictated by the young Pastor Noble Alexander, of his life in a Cuban prison, where he was determined to fight to stay alive and remain faithful to his Lord inside the very gates of hell. In our last reading, we covered chapter 10, entitled University Under Shadows, where after a year of the communist re-education plan, not only did the plan not work, but the prison church and the Christian movement within the prison grew in strength and numbers. In a further attempt to weaken their movement, they were moved to another work location under still harsher conditions, where the prisoners could be shot for the slightest infraction. Nonetheless, God prevailed, and one of the prisoners, Carlos, was able to get a Bible from one of the civilians with whom they were put to work in a citrus orchard. He hid the Bible under his shirt and covered it with a plastic bag and his metal dinner plate. He was discovered and shot. The bullet penetrated the metal plate, but not the Bible, and it was counted as a miracle which spread like wildfire throughout the prison underground and drew yet more numbers to the church. The advent of a new prisoner, an Olympic boxer who had tried to escape to the West but was caught, and who had a great love for Jesus, joined their church and was baptized in the prison and became a lay preacher, and the church grew yet more because of his involvement. They were soon able to start a university within their church as their numbers grew. Again, Noble was punished for refusing to obey the political officer who tried to lure him outside the guard's circle of protection so he could be killed while trying to escape. For this, he was again sentenced to 21 days in the dungeon and shot in the leg. He returned to a hero's welcome of 25 brethren gathering around him and singing. When the guards threatened to shoot if they didn't stop singing, all the other prisoners joined in, and the guards could do nothing to stop the power of God displayed in their love and unity. For this and other resistance, our hero, Noble Alexander, was transferred to the marble quarry, known as the TB pit, where the constant inhalation of the powdery granite and the limestone dust caused many prisoners to come down with tuberculosis. We continue our reading today with chapters 11 and 12, entitled first, Promises Made, Promises Broken, and In His Footsteps. We begin with chapter 11, Promises Made, Promises Broken. The next morning at the marble quarry, I climbed out of the truck into the sunlight. At the end of the roll call, a guard handed me a pick and sent me to a section of the quarry where I worked with Isaac de la Campa, a former policeman from Batista's force. As I worked, I glanced about at the blood-stained walls of the quarry, where guards had stabbed or shot countless prisoners for whatever minor infractions of the rules they could contrive. Such a waste of human potential, I thought. Such wickedness. The watchman assigned to take care of the tools secretly kept a herd of small livestock in the quarry, including hens and roosters. During the day, one of his roosters was out parading for a group of hens when a chicken hawk swooped down from the sky. The rooster fell to the ground in a faint. His comb faded to white, as if every drop of blood had spilled out of it. The chicken hawk, thinking the rooster was dead, took off again. The rooster remained motionless for 5 minutes. Once it was certain the hawk was gone, it got up, flapped its wings, and crowed as if saying, "I won." I turned toward Isaac and grimaced. This is a place of terror, even for the cock. Even the fowls learn to fear here. At the end of the day, my throat and lungs ached. The excruciating pain behind my eyes pulsated to the rhythm of my heartbeat, and my arms felt as if they would drop off. The truck bounced over the rough gravel roads on the way back to prison, giving me time to think. I wondered if I would survive even 1 week working in the quarry. That evening, the foreman learned that I had welding and mechanical experience. When I arrived for work on the second day, he reassigned me to weld the broken parts on one of the machines. Unfortunately, the prisoners considered that anyone who worked as a professional or a tradesman at his skill was aiding the regime. The prison officials understood this, yet they persisted. "No, I can't," I said. "It has been many years since I did that kind of work." "Go on," he insisted. "Just try it, see if you can." "What if I don't want to try?" I asked. His lips formed a thin, grim line for a moment. Then he answered, "If you refuse, we will consider it as sabotage." "Well, I'm sorry. Because if anything went wrong, I would be charged with the guilt anyway. So I prefer not to even touch that machine." Irked by my refusal, he assigned me to the lime pit, the TB division, as the prisoners called it. There, I, along with a number of other prisoners, shoveled white lime. Without proper safety masks, we inhaled the fine dust particles throughout the day. By the time we arrived back at the prison, we wheezed ourselves to sleep. The lethal combination of severe malnutrition and layers of lime dust in one's lungs made tuberculosis an almost guaranteed fate. Inmate after inmate succumbed to the quarry's exhausting environment and the soldiers' brutality. The mindless work in the quarry allowed me time to think. As I broke rock, I exercised my memory by reciting Bible texts and singing my way through the church's hymn book. I carried on my long conversations with God and created mental images of my beautiful Iraida. I cannot even guess how many times I relived our wedding day as I labored beneath the stifling tropical sun. The more details I could recall, the less pain I consciously felt. My routine was predictable. August 3rd, 1959, our wedding day. Members from the Mariano and Cerro churches packed my mother-in-law's small home to attend our wedding. I remembered the broad smile on Pastor Roberto Acosta's face as he prepared to conduct the ceremony. He later laughed about how sober my face looked as I stood in front of him, waiting for my bride to appear. "I was afraid you might pass out on me," he joked. "Talk about a frightened groom." I tried to remember the names of the 4 candle bearers and of the little Bible boy. Sometimes the names and faces would surface. Other times, my mind refused to cooperate. This scared me. I couldn't allow the devils who held me captive to rob me of my memory. When my mind went on strike, I would plead with God. "Help me, Father. Help me to hold on to these precious memories." When my mind cooperated, I continued reliving the wedding ceremony, watching each of the bridal attendants come down the aisle and take their places. I enjoyed a perverse delight in holding off my most vivid memory, my first glimpse of Iraida in her blush pink wedding gown. I gasped at the vision of the beautiful woman soon to be my wife. I could almost feel the texture of my white linen suit as nervously I ran the edges of my sleeves back and forth between my thumbs and forefingers. The word radiant couldn't do justice to the glow on her face as she walked down the aisle toward me. I've never seen any woman look so stunningly beautiful. Eagerly I went to meet her, took her arm gently in mine, and turned to face the pastor. At this point, the shout of a guard often jarred me back to the present. "Stop being a gold brick, 31450. I hastened to obey, since anything less than instant obedience produced guaranteed violence on the guard's part. So when the prison authorities announced a visitor's day, I could scarcely keep my mind on anything else until I learned just what a visit from one's wife, mother, and children entailed. In preparation for the visit, the prisoners would be forced to strip naked, then in a squatting position, jump so as to be certain they had hidden nothing in their colons that could be smuggled out. With all the other atrocities and violations against our human sensibilities, we could tolerate one more in order to have the privilege of seeing those we loved, until we learned that our visitors would be put through the same ordeal. That's when the prisoners went on strike. After some time, the prison officials agreed to make the inmates go through the body search, both going in and coming out, rather than subject the visitors to such treatment. The first visiting day will stand out in my memory forever. The pathetic scene in the reception room defied description. Mothers wailed as if they mourned their sons' deaths. Wives and daughters clung to their husbands and fathers. Some fainted at the sight of their loved ones' emaciated bodies. Others had fits of hysteria, while still others quivered uncontrollably in shock, struck speechless by the horror of the moment. I searched for Iraida, but she failed to come. Something terrible must have happened to her, I reasoned. I know that my son often suffered from tropical dysentery. Perhaps she or Umberto had taken ill or died, or my mind invented every nightmarish fantasy possible. When she didn't appear 45 days later for the second visiting day, I had to know what was wrong. So I smuggled out a note to her. On the third visiting day, I entered the reception area, terrified that again she would not come. A numbing relief flooded through me when I saw her standing toward the back of the crowd of women. Delighted, I ran to her. Yet, even in the first few moments as I approached her, I sensed a strange reserve about her. She's just uncomfortable with the surroundings, I reasoned. After all, what woman with such delicate sensibilities could act natural in such an awkward situation? When she pulled out a cigarette and lighted it, a cacophony of warning bells clanged away in my head. After she left, a former neighbor of ours visited my cell. "I hate to be the one to tell you this, Noble," he began, "but you have to be strong. My wife told me that Iraida has been seeing an army captain. What? I don't believe it, I shouted, clenching and unclenching my fists. I could feel a raging anger tearing apart my insides. Never a man given to violence, I ached with an unfamiliar urge to punch something or someone, anyone. I refused to believe it. Other wives might be unfaithful to their imprisoned husbands, but not Iraida. I shook my head violently to rid myself of the mere suggestion. My neighbor grabbed me by the shoulders, bringing my denial to a sudden halt. Noble, it's true. She plans to divorce you. No! 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 My Iraida is a good Christian woman. She would never. Noting the pain in my friend's eyes, I paused. Fear engulfed me. I swallowed hard in order to abort the flood of tears threatening to undo me. I will write to her, and she will deny these charges. You will see how wrong these rumors are, I shouted. Without another word, he turned and left me standing in the middle of my cell. In the next few days, with the help of a prisoner about to be released, I managed to smuggle a letter out to Iraida. I asked her if what our neighbor said was true. When she replied, she completely denied the entire story. I thought of the words of Proverbs 31:10 and 11. Who can find a virtuous woman? For her price is far above rubies. The heart of her husband doth safely trust in her, so that he shall have no need of spoil. During the weeks that followed, even the work at the marble quarry couldn't get me down. I praised God again and again for my beautiful, faithful wife. More good news followed Iraida's letter. Through the prison's gossip line, we learned that the officials would soon be shipping the political and religious prisoners back to the main island of Cuba. Our exile would soon be over. At the quarry, we worked with new enthusiasm. No one wanted to die or be killed by a guard's bayonet at the last moment before going home. When one of the other inmates threatened to react to a guard's abuse or to do some other stupid or careless act, the rest of us would stop him with, "It's not worth it. Probably tomorrow we will go back to Cuba." Unfortunately, it took 1 year and 8 months for the rumor to become a reality. Meanwhile, the guards took advantage of the prisoners' lack of defiance and intensified their brutality. On Wednesday evening, the night before our scheduled departure, the church family joined for a mass prayer meeting. Each man shared his testimony of his struggle and of a faith triumphant. We sang the words to praise Him, Jesus our blessed Redeemer, with renewed vigor. The poignant question in the song, "Oh, the ways long and weary," took on an entirely new meaning as we stood on the brink of our departure. Nationality, religious persuasion, race, and politics dissolved as we formed a giant prayer circle. As brothers in Christ, we were closer than any physical brothers could possibly be. Angered by our prayer meeting, the prison officials rousted us out of our bunks much earlier than usual the next morning. At the quarry, the guards hurried us to our areas and took count. Then the beating began. At one moment we were standing there listening for our numbers, when suddenly, without warning, the soldiers were beating on us with their rifle butts and bayonets. The prison officials reserved their harshest brutality for blacks and Americans. Blacks, because the revolution had come to emancipate them, and by refusing to become a part of the revolution, we were ungrateful. And Americans, because as imperialists, they intended to stifle the revolution. The lieutenant gave an order for the guards to beat Larry Lunt, an American prisoner and a relative of the Queen of Belgium. This wealthy Christian gentleman owned a large farm in Pinar del Rio, at the extreme west part of the island of Cuba. The Cuban government confiscated his farm, saying he had aided the rebels, and sentenced him to 30 years hard labor on the Isle of Pines. Hating the Americans as they did, the guards especially targeted this formerly wealthy gringo landowner to suffer their vengeance. Minutes later, a guard shot another prisoner, Chico Praderas, in the abdomen. Both men lived in spite of the irrational violence unleashed. One man I will always remember was Elroy Menoya, a former high-ranking officer in Castro's army. When he and 50 of his men questioned the route the revolution was taking, they were taken to prison and charged with conspiring against the revolution. Elroy was assigned to the quarry block. Seldom did a month go by, but the guards would lug him back to the circular at night, a bundle of meat and blood. How long would his body be able to absorb the indecent abuse it suffered? A few days earlier, in one of the fields, a prisoner by the name of Reynaldo Aquí had escaped. The guards hadn't been watching us closely since they knew the inmates would soon be going home. The soldiers ended their unsuccessful search for Reynaldo 4 days later. Reprimanded by their superiors for their carelessness, the guards were out for blood. Our blood. When the soldiers brought us back to the prison that night, after the violence at the quarry, we lined up for counting. The hat fell off the head of Chino Aquí, Reynaldo's brother. He asked for permission to pick it up, which gave the guards all the excuse for violence they needed. After the officer gave Chino permission to retrieve his hat, Chino stepped out of the lineup, bent down to pick up the hat, and bang, they shot him. He planned to escape like his brother. The two of them planned it together, the lieutenant said, defying anyone to disagree. He then gave an order to have the entire block severely beaten. When the soldiers exhausted their pent-up energy and hate, the lieutenant ordered us back to the circular. 3 of the brothers lay dead on the cold stone floor. They paid the price for Reynaldo's escape and for the mass prayer meeting we had held the night before. The death of our brothers in Christ had sullied our anticipated joy over transfer back to a mainland prison. So many deaths, so much waste, I thought. As I considered the possibility of leaving Isle of Pines, I recalled the names and faces of those who would not be leaving with us, those who would remain a part of the island until Jesus' return. The end of chapter 11. Chapter 12 of I Will Die Free, entitled In His Footsteps. The ferryboat whistle blasted, filling my senses with exhilaration and hope. Going home. I was going home. Even having to sit for 6 hours in one position in the hold of the boat didn't deaden my enthusiasm. I had no idea to what prison I'd be sent or what the living conditions might be like. But it didn't matter. Just being back on the mainland appeared as a sign that I would survive. I would one day be free. While no one dared speak, I could sense the same excitement in the other prisoners as we crowded together inside the hold of the ferry. When the ferry anchored at Batabano Pier outside of the capital city of Havana, the dock was filled with family members of the incoming prisoners straining to see their loved ones, and with policemen, trained dogs, and military guards straining equally hard to prevent them from reaching the prisoners. Under strict guard, we boarded the buses, and as always, we sat in the buses for 5 hours, weak from hunger, thirst, and heat exhaustion. Finally, the buses began to roll toward our unknown destiny. One of the drivers made a wrong turn and got lost, along with his cargo of guards, dogs, and prisoners, causing the rest of us to sit for another 2 hours while the prison officials frantically tried to locate the missing bus. We arrived in the city of Sagua La Grande to a hero's welcome. Sagua La Grande, an important city in the midsection of the province of Las Villas, is in the mountainous part of Cuba, a natural shelter for many rebels who opposed Castro. When the citizens of the city learned that a contingency of political prisoners was being transferred to Sagua's prison, they flooded the streets. When the drivers tried to park the buses alongside the city streets, the people swarmed the bus, giving us all kinds of goodies, coffee, milk, cookies, candy, etc. The guards on the buses tried to stop them, but short of a massacre, there was little they could do. Finally, the chief guard announced, "You may give them whatever you like, just do not board the buses." By evening, the officials decided the people of Sagua's sympathy for us was so great, the government could not risk placing us there. So we were transferred to another prison before we even arrived at the first one. We were told that the Sagua prison was too small to house us. And by 10 that night, we arrived at Remedios prison. Once we established residence in our new quarters, we began daily worship services. We elected Gerard Alvarez, also known as the Brother in the Faith, to lead out in our morning worship. Before becoming a Christian, Gigi, as he was called, had lived a life of violence as a pimp and a loan shark. But in prison, he found Jesus Christ and was transformed by the power of God. His natural charisma and his desire to tell others of his new faith made him a perfect candidate to preach God's word. Before the first week ended, neighboring civilians complained to the guards that our worship services disturbed them. Some of our neighbors worked nights, and our singing didn't allow them to sleep during the day. The prison director punished the entire religious and political prison population for this infraction. Over the loudspeaker, he announced, "The following rules will be strictly enforced. 1. You will be allowed 10 minutes to eat your supper. 2. You will appear well-dressed in the dining room. 3. You cannot speak to anyone. 4. You cannot sit until everyone at your table is in place, and then you must sit in the same sequence you arrived at the table. And 5. You must remain seated until everyone is finished or the 10 minutes has expired." The punishment came when the dining room official began counting the 10 minutes with the first table to begin eating instead of the last. This meant the majority of prisoners would either need to wolf their food down almost without chewing or go hungry since no food could be removed from the area. One morning, they served boiled fish, a real treat. The fish contained lots of tiny bones that needed to be removed before eating it. We managed to eat less than half of our allotment when the departure bell rang. angry and starving, every prisoner in the room picked up his metal plate. Fish and bones flew in every direction. Some overturned their plates on top of the tables, while others dumped the food onto the floor. A few of the bravest prisoners flung the fish against the dining room walls in protest. Before the last piece of fish had slid down the wall onto the floor, a troop of soldiers, their rifles and bayonets leveled for action, burst into the building, shouting and beating anyone in their way. Brutally, they cleared the dining room. Early the next morning, 3 buses waited in the prison courtyard to take us and our meager belongings to other prisons. When the officials announced that we were being moved to another prison, we church members stuck together, knowing it would improve our chances of being housed in the same prison units. After searching each of us thoroughly, the guards ordered us to board the buses. "What happened in Sagua La Grande will never happen again," the officer in charge announced. "We will not allow anyone the opportunity to manifest his sympathies for you traitors of the state again." Once on board, we waited to depart. All day long, we waited until 10 o'clock that evening. Finally, the driver started the engines, and we left Remedios prison behind for an unknown destination. 59 days after our arrival from Isle of Pines. We arrived at La Cabana prison 8 hours later, suffering from the effects of heat exhaustion, hunger, and extreme tiredness. The new prison guards eyed us as we climbed off the buses the way hungry wolves might inspect a flock of sheep. Before leaving Remedios prison, the members of the church had schemed a way to be together at the new prison. Our plan worked. We were assigned to the same gallery, patio number 2. News of our arrival preceded us, for as we entered patio number 2, the inmates in the different galleries surrounding the yard began singing in Spanish the words, "In hardships and struggles, the church always continues." This show of defiance infuriated the La Cabana officials, since they had declared that the prisoners could not talk to one another, let alone sing. They assigned a special force to each gallery to ensure that no one spoke a word. It took some adjustment to get acquainted with the unique problems of living at La Cabana. The lack of sufficient food was the biggest problem. Second, with 200 prisoners housed in a gallery designed for 86, personalities could not help but clash regularly. The third adjustment came from a lack of sufficient restroom facilities and the common bathing area in the yard that served all the surrounding galleries. The showers consisted of a long half-inch pipe that ran the length of a wall. Smaller quarter-inch pipes protruded at appropriate intervals from the larger pipe. These were the shower heads. One faucet, operated by a guard, controlled the water's flow. Soon after our arrival at La Cabana, we learned exactly how the showers worked. The gallery door swung open, and one of the prison guards entered, whereupon, according to the rule, all of the prisoners snapped to attention. The arrival of a guard usually meant trouble. Either someone would be beaten or taken to interrogation. But this time, the soldier stepped inside the gallery and shouted, "Prepare for shower!" Immediately, the guard swung the door wide open and the inmates dashed for the showers. "Run, Noble," one of my friends whispered. The instant the gate swung open, the guard operating the faucet turned on the water and began timing the shower. Bewildered, I looked about at the chaos. There was no privacy and no time to prepare. It had been 3 or 4 days since I'd been allowed to bathe, so I hurried into the fray. I had just soaped up when the guard turned off the water. All I could do was dry off and returned to my gallery worse than before. For some reason, the guards did this for entertainment. The ill treatment of the prisoners operated much like a musical scale, with each gallery officer striving to inflict the highest note of discomfort and misery possible on his charges. For all their variations to the beatings, starvations, and humiliation, our captors never seemed to run out of new ideas to make our lives miserable. One morning, 3 days after they shuffled us from one section of the prison to another, we were conducting morning worship when a colonel, 2 commanders, and 3 captains entered patio number 2 and called the gallery directors and the prisoners' elected representatives to the administrative offices. We knew that one way or another, such a visit could only spell trouble for us. When our elected representative returned from this meeting, he announced, "The prison officials have decided to allow your families to visit for your monthly visit. They may bring to you a package of supplies weighing up to 35 pounds. This parcel may include 3 books from the approved list, writing paper, pencils." He continued reading the list of approved items. Those of us who had been incarcerated for any length of time at all listened in skeptical belief, suspicious of their act of apparent kindness. The visiting day proved to be all the officials promised. Iraida arrived in the large visitors' gallery, prepared by her brother to seduce me into the re-education plan. An officer sat off to one side, listening as she skillfully wove her spell over me, taunting, teasing, tantalizing my senses, using my love for her as the weapon to catch and destroy me. Oh God, I prayed, observing the lovely woman offering herself to me. How can I resist? Suddenly, as if startled awake, I realized what was happening, and with the realization came the strength to resist. "Iraida," I said, grasping her by the shoulders and holding her at arm's length, "I would prefer death before accepting what you offer." For an instant, pain over what we had lost and anger at being scorned flitted across her face. But then a haughty pride settled in. She withdrew from my grasp and lifted her chin defiantly. "I have no more time to lose. You can continue to follow those people in there if you wish." She paused to change tactics. "Other Christian brothers have accepted the proposal. Are you better than them? They realize they have a duty to support their wives and kids. They know their duty." Her accusations punched me in the softest portions of my heritage, a male's duty to support his family. Regaining my composure, I replied, "Yes, they know their duties, but I know mine. They are frustrated with their decision. I am not. They betrayed their God, but I will not betray mine." I had barely finished speaking when the officer listening to our conversation declared, "Your visit is over." Uncertain I'd heard him correctly, I asked, "Is the visiting period up?" "No," he replied, "only your visit is over." Iraida stood up, glanced at me one more time, turned on her heel, and left the room. When our guests left, Colonel Lemus, the prison director, assembled the prisoners and collected their gift parcels before they had even been opened. "By order of the Minister of the Interior, there are going to be some changes made, to be announced at a future date. To receive your gifts, you must agree to our conditions. and there must be a marked improvement in your behavior. The visit had proved to be a trap for all of us, a moment of pleasure to cling to, with promises of more to come if we cooperated with the military. The conditions involved turning in our yellow uniforms that identified us as political prisoners for the blue uniforms worn by the common criminals. All of us immediately recognized the significance of the change in uniforms. It had developed out of an interesting history. The color coding of military uniforms had begun years earlier when Cuba gained its independence from Spain. The system's popularity died out for a time until the government rewrote the country's constitution in 1940. At that time, it was decided to have the police force wear blue, the Navy white, and the Army yellow. During the 1953 rebellion, the rural police and the regular army had carried out most of the action. So when Castro gained control of the country in 1959, his revenge against the two branches of the military was to designate that their once proud uniforms be worn by prisoners. Blue by the common criminals and yellow by the political prisoners. The new army wore olive green. At first, the citizens of Cuba hated the prisoners who wore yellow. It was a symbol of rebellion. The revolutionary government hadn't been in charge long, however, before the people's attitude changed. The prisoners became instant heroes, and their yellow uniforms became badges of honor. Whenever the prison officials transferred one of the political prisoners to a new prison or to a hospital, he received the civilians' concern instead of their scorn. It was only a matter of time before this growing tide of sympathy both angered and worried the Minister of the Interior and the Central Committee members. To avoid a riot or further civil disobedience, they decided to dress all the prisoners in the blue uniform of the common prisoners. The next morning, a fleet of trucks arrived carrying bundles of blue uniforms as well as 80 extra soldiers. I, along with the rest of the prison population, eyed the uniforms being unloaded with disgust. Obviously, the prison director expected trouble from the political and religious prisoners. Besides bringing in extra troops, he arranged for the prisoners to run a gauntlet of soldiers wielding bayonets, clubs, chains, and segments of iron pipes. He announced that at the end of the gauntlet, we would have a choice. We could enter cell number 9, remove our yellow uniforms, and take our blue uniforms. Or we could enter cell number 7 and remove our yellow uniforms. All of us would be required to leave the cell clad in nothing but our underwear. Of course, anyone who chose to wear the prison blues would give justification for his incarceration. He would be classified as a common thief, rapist, or murderer. Being religious or political dissenters set us apart, and we could not afford to lose that distinction. Of the political prisoners who ran the gauntlet and shed their uniforms, 850 chose not to wear the blues. Angry with our strong show of defiance, the captain in charge corralled all of us into 2 galleries that had been stripped of bunks and furniture of any kind. 850 men in a space built to house 86. Those who found a spot where they could sit down on the cold granite floor considered themselves lucky. In order to give everyone a chance to rest, we established a 4-hour sleep rotation. The prison officials gave us time to wear down from lack of sleep and from starvation before they began the next phase of their inquisition. Total compliance became a matter of honor for our interrogators. One by one, The guards led each of us from the gallery to the interrogation rooms, where an army officer waited, determined to break our wills. "Alexander," the captain demanded when I appeared, "why must you be so belligerent and unreasonable? Must you challenge everything we do?" "I am not a common prisoner." The captain slammed his fist on the desktop. "You defy us in the revolution. The revolution is good and you are wrong. Wrong. Wrong." Silently, I stared ahead. Nothing I could say would make any difference. Suddenly, he leaped up from the desk, grabbed my throat, and pushed me backward. My head slammed against the concrete cinder blocks with such force that shooting stars flashed around in my head. "Admit it," he screamed. "Admit that you are wrong and the great revolution is right." I tried to turn my head to indicate my disagreement when his fist crunched against my nose. I felt a snap. Then blood spurted out all over his uniform and my bare chest. He shoved me backward once more and walked away in disgust. "Get him out of here," the captain ordered the guard. "The miserable plantado." Plantado was the name for one who had been firmly planted. Political prisoners who defied the government's re-education efforts. Back at the gallery, the guards continued the verbal and physical abuse. "You are a plantado. You do not deserve to wear the clothing given you by the revolution." Faint from the pain in my head and the loss of blood, I asked to see a doctor. "A doctor?" the guard laughed. "Plantados do not deserve medical treatment. Nor will you be allowed books to read, letters from family, or monthly visitation privileges any longer. Unless, of course, you..." My fellow prisoners didn't wait for the end of his speech. We had heard it so often in the past. They led me to an open spot on the floor where I could lie down and try to stop the bleeding. The last scrap of dignity had been removed from us when we chose to remain firm to what we believed. We would show them, we decided. Plantados? Yes, we would be plantados. We would defy their attempts at re-education. For the next 17 years, I wore nothing but underwear. The prison officials counted on the crushing summer heat, the human odors from so many men living in such close quarters, and the gnawing hunger to wear us down. Instead, after the first few days, we adjusted to our new environment by setting up rules that would enable us to live together in an orderly fashion. We elected a gallery elder to maintain order. It has been said that in the time of trouble, God's people will cling more to God. During our times of trouble, when we had no religious materials whatsoever, this was also true. The inmates flocked together to worship, to learn more of the Bible, to sing hymns and to pray. A core of us spent every spare minute of our time orally training the new converts. Our enemies bided their time. Winter would soon arrive. Lack of proper food, lack of clothing, we would weaken. "You will soon be begging us on your knees to re-educate you," our guards chided. As if our tormentors had satanic powers that could control the weather, the winter temperatures dropped to unbelievable lows, 50 degrees, 40 degrees, and into the 30s. Prisoners and soldiers alike suffered in the unusual cold, and the plantados suffered the worst. "I can't go on," one young man whispered through clenched teeth. "I'm so cold." "I know, brother," one of the church elders assured him, "but together we can make it. Together." I'm not so sure about that," the younger man replied, glancing out into the yard. where a group of soldiers stood warming their hands over an open fire. Maybe I could, just for a short time. His words drifted off longingly. Yes, another prisoner answered, his voice quivering from weakness as well as from the cold. Only until spring, then we could change our minds. No, the elder argued. You will not be allowed to rescind your confession. Please, stand firm. We can make it together. Conversations such as this occurred more and more frequently as the temperatures continued to drop until they reached the incredible all-time low of 38 degrees Fahrenheit. The criminal prisoners had quite a bit more freedom than the political prisoners. Among other things, since they were housed in different parts of the prison, they were issued daily newspapers to read. However, the prisoners between the two sections quickly established a highly efficient system for smuggling papers from them to us. Not only did these newspapers provide us with some contact with the outside world, they also provided us with warmth. We stuffed old newspapers around the cracks of the door to cut down on the cold breezes blowing through the cells. The prison director ordered that nothing could cover the prison doors, yet we persisted. Each morning the guards scooped up the newspapers, claiming that they blocked their view of our activities. Ironically, this move worked against the government's plan instead of for it, implanting steel in the backbones of the plantados who had been seriously considering accepting the government's re-education plan in exchange for warmth and clothing. The Spirit of God drew us closer together. It is amazing how much of one's body a handkerchief can cover, how much heat one human body expels, the warmth one can receive from a single roll of toilet tissue. Each morning, the guards searched our cells and removed anything we might have used for survival from the previous night. They would then use whatever they found to warm themselves. When we refused to give in or to die, the officials intensified their efforts by removing the only personal freedom we had left, our sleep. They installed loudspeakers at the gates to our gallery. Every 2 hours throughout the night, the loudspeakers roared to life to the tune of an ancient folk song that claimed, "More than 1,000 years, many more you'll have to wait. I do not know if eternity will have an end." A string of propaganda from the health department followed. Prisoners in such undernourished condition, sleeping on the floor, will catch colds. Untreated, these colds can very easily become tuberculosis. With the loss of blood, you will become anemic. If this anemia continues, you will contract leukemia. The government does not want this to happen to you, but you have a free will. If you accept the government's plan, you are accepting life. If you reject our offer, you are choosing a slow but sure death. Many good men believed the government's propaganda and gave in. As they fell away, those remaining pressed together. Night after night, for more than 2 months, the routine continued. Life grew more impossible with each passing day. Something had to be done. But what? What could a bunch of starving, half-naked political cast-offs do to put pressure on the Cuban prison officials who seemingly held all the cards? The end of chapter 12, entitled In His Footsteps.